Let me ask you a question. How do you live for Christ in a culture that seems to celebrate everything God condemns? Do we hide away from it all? Do we just go along with the flow? Or can we live right here in the middle of it, steady, joyful, and pure, without being swallowed by it? Good morning. Welcome to God's Resistance. Glad to have you tune in here with us. We're going to be talking about the whatsoever is and how to live in our culture. So first, we're going to look at Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. And he says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." So when we become Christians, we often become part of this pendulum effect. And what I mean by that is we lived a life of sin, and then after we become Christians, we look at where we came from. We don't want to have anything to do with it, so we swing clear off in the other direction. And then there's kind of this time where our life looks like it's maimed. And I know Oswald Chambers says something like it's, you know how Jesus said to chop off the arm, pluck out the eye, that kind of thing. So we look like we live something of a maimed life. And the thing is, you and I need that distance from those things that will destroy us, or we risk being sucked back into sin. So it makes sense to have that happen. But then there comes something of a balancing effect that God does in us. How do we relate to the world after we have been saved out of it? We're told in the scriptures that friendship with the world is enmity with God or hostile towards God. Well, some have closeted themselves away from the world so that they didn't get tainted by the world, and that's like the monks and cloistered off in their communes. Some have just looked at their Christian life as a change of standing in a legal sense with God, and they can still just live at large however they please. Some have hemmed their life in with extra biblical rules with such high fences that it seems almost impossible to relate with the people of the world that they're trying to reach. You know, Philippi had some of these same issues. They had to deal with the same kind of culture that you and I have in some respect, much similarities. Philippi was a flourishing city and one of the most flourishing cities in the Roman Empire. It was known for its gold mines, which contributed to its wealth. Had about 10 to 15,000 people that were there, mostly farmers, peasants, servant providers, and slaves. There was a significant minority of retired Roman military veterans that lived there, and they had a ton of sway. Rome colonized this originally Greek city, and after that, it was compromised of Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians, so it was a melting pot. There was a large number of gods that were worshipped there, one of which was the imperial cult, or the emperor worship. Caesar's claim was to be Lord and Savior who brings salvation and peace to the world. Kind of sounds like Jesus, right? This was part of the culture. It wasn't a dominant part, but this is kind of what we could see in Philippi at that time. And then there was also a very small Jewish population. There was no synagogue, but simply a place of prayer. You can read that in Acts 16. There needed to be 10 Jewish men before a synagogue could be formed, but there was no synagogue, so there wasn't even 10 Jewish men. There was just ladies gathering by a river for prayer, one of whom was Lydia, and she wasn't even a Jew. She was a Gentile worshiper of God. So how do we keep our eyes? We're looking at that, and we see what it was like, very small influence for the God of heaven there in Philippi. It's not a whole lot different today in the days in which we live. How do we keep our eyes single on Christ and then still live in this world without being of this world? Well, Philippians has an answer. The Philippian converts had to wrestle with these same questions just like you and I do. They were in a pluralistic society, and the values of the culture didn't always align with the values of Christianity. You don't, however, see Paul telling them to go and build a commune outside of the culture. Rather, he tells us to look for the whatever. So the grace of God empowers us to live in this present evil world and make a change for good and the glory of God and the expansion of his kingdom by looking for the whatevers. It says whatever, or another translation would say whatsoever. But let's talk about these whatevers. What is the whatever? Well, we aren't to look at the culture around us with fear. We are to look at the culture in the world around us and seek out the things that are beautiful. We are to affirm those things that align with God's heart. Remember, Jesus said that we are like leaven in a wicked world. Christians are leaven tucked in the dough of a lost world around them, and it takes time for that dough, for that yeast to permeate, and to the leaven to permeate and to make the culture rise more into the glory of God. So I would ask this question: is everything in culture that is not explicitly Christian something to be shunned? Think about music, art, writing, traditions, holidays. I think that's a rhetorical question because we realize there are some redeemable things that are part of culture that aren't evil or wicked, and they're not explicitly Christian either. But I think about holidays. So first, before we go on, I want you to just suspend judgment. I have my opinions and discernment on this, and some of that will come out in a minute. But I just want to bring up a point here. The Catholic Church over the years, when they were going into different areas of pagan society, instead of just going in there and bulldozing culture completely out of the way, they tried to syncretize these things. Maybe that's a bad word because it almost seems like I think that sometimes the Catholic Church did go along with things that they shouldn't have, but I can kind of see where they were coming from. Sometimes I would say it was somewhat benign, and other times it wasn't very good. But we're trying to get a principle out of this. I think about Christmas. That was a Roman celebration of Saturnalia, pagan winter solstice. They had feasting, they gave gifts, there was evergreen trees, and then the Catholic Church tried to overlay Christ in there. And even if Jesus wasn't really born December 25th, they tried to replace that worship of the sun with the worship of the Son of God, and yet retaining something of their customs that were benign in and of themselves. And they condemned their other practices as superstitious excesses and tried to redirect them towards God. Same thing with Easter. That was some kind of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon rites. They had fertility symbols, eggs, bunnies, right? Well, the Catholic Church came in and said, why don't we think about resurrection of Christ, right? And reframe it from nature worship to salvation. Then we think of Halloween, right? That's going along with this time of the year. The pagan origins of that was Celtic. It was called Samhain. I think it's pronounced Samhain in Celtic. That was October 31st. It was when the harvest ended, the winter started, and spirits were said to roam, and the veil between the physical and the spiritual was very thin. They had masks, bonfires, food offerings to appease the dead. And then the church, it was specifically, from what I've read, 835 AD, Pope Gregory overlays November 1st, All Saints Day, on Samhain for conversions. So All Hallows Eve vigil was reframing the costumes that these people dressed in to try to trick the evil spirits that they were afraid of into honoring saints, dressing in costumes of saints, and the treats that were given out at those times to appease these wicked spirits, rather give alms, right? Now, you don't have to necessarily agree with this, but it seems to be that the church over the centuries tried to not completely bulldoze the culture, but tried to turn the culture into a more Christocentric culture, right? But now we come into the days now of Halloween, and it's trick or treat and the costumes and all those kind of things, and it's often fairly gory and not very redeemable. So we're not going to judge on that yet. That's going to be something I want to talk about in a minute on that. So the early saints, they didn't just burn the dough of culture, but they needed it. They needed the dough with Christian leaven. So we can ask ourselves, and I know I was speaking more at length about holidays and stuff there, but we can ask ourselves, does this music, does this art, does this writing, whether it's novels or poems, does this holiday, does this tradition honor the true and pure Savior, or does it drag you back to the shadows? So here are some helpful questions that you can ask when trying to discern things in your own life. Is this thing that I'm concerned about inherently contrary to the Word of God? If it is, you don't need to go any further. We're all done right here. Throw it out the window. We don't need it. Now, if you say, I don't really think it is expressly forbidden in the scriptures, and so you could say, well, it's permissible. Well, if it's permissible, is it the most profitable? So this is about choosing the highest good. Sometimes we may enter our Christian life and we think there's nothing inherently wrong with this. And as we start walking with God, we start realizing, you know what? There isn't something inherently wrong with this, but I have found something so much better. And so we may leave off things because we found something better. The other question we can ask is, what effect does this benign thing have upon me in my mind, in my emotions, and in my heart? Does it make my spirit dull to the things of God? Does it affect me in a positive sense, maybe? Does it help me to de-stress? Now, obviously, we realize if this goes flat against the scriptures, we already have our answer. But there's a wide latitude of things that the scriptures doesn't necessarily speak about, and sometimes people's conscience trouble them about it, and sometimes they don't. And we have to allow the liberty of the Spirit of God in people's lives, and because of their backgrounds, there's all sorts of stuff. We have to answer that question. If you are bothered in your conscience about things, even though you may see somebody else doing it, don't say, you have to be bound by my conscience. Simply put it off yourself. Leave it alone. It's nothing. It's something that maybe attaches to you in a way, and you just can't do it. So what effect does this benign thing have on others, other Christians, especially new converts? Is it going to help them, or is it going to destroy them? What about the unbeliever? What effect does it have on them? What about your family? Whatever here means whatever. All things we may have to interact with in life. We as Christians are to engage in the culture, not to hide from it. This does not mean we partake with everything in the culture. We should inject our Christian influence in the culture. And you may ask, how do I do that? By looking for certain qualities, which Paul brings up here in this verse. The first quality, he says, is whatsoever is true. So it doesn't matter where the truth comes from, because truth stands objectively outside us. We could recognize truth even from an enemy's lips. But what we allow in our lives, or even how we try to Christianize culture, must bow before the ultimate truth of God found in his word. Beyond this, there is a wide latitude of application. Often missionaries would come from America or Europe, and they would go into other areas. And instead of helping them to be disciples of Christ alone, what they did is they tried to westernize them, make them more like Europeans. But that's not what Jesus wants. Our cultures, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with every part of our culture. It's unique because it's diverse people groups. But we need to Christianize them in bringing Christ into the middle of the culture and making disciples without having to completely bulldoze their culture out of the way. So I cannot wholesale condemn the strategy that the Catholic Church used over the years, but I can't wholesale say that everything they did was right. They were trying, it seems, to steer people to Christ out of their pagan roots. Sometimes when they did it, it was effective and benign. Other times, like Mary worship and praying for dead saints and everything surrounding Halloween, it seems to be that wasn't so great, okay? In fact, it leads people off in an unscriptural direction. There's not much in our present day, regardless of its pagan roots, redeemable or worthy of celebration in Halloween. It glorifies death and witchcraft and evil. But we could go back and ask those same series of questions that I mentioned before to work through all these things. I will say this, though. We have used Halloween. People are going to come to the doors and knock on doors for trick-or-treating or whatever. We put a piece of candy and a tract in a bag, and if we have conversations, we start those things up as well. We think to ourselves, I don't agree with all this thing, but the fact of the matter is loads of people are going to be out here doing this, and some people get all spooky. Don't do this. It's going to destroy you and ruin you. If Jesus is living within me, I have nothing to fear about all that stuff. So we pass out tracts to people, right? Whatsoever is honorable. Teddy Roosevelt, he had a boy, a bigger boy was picking on this younger boy's sister, and that younger boy punched the other boy right in the eye and gave him a black eye. And he said, I did it even on the Lord's Day. And Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Sunday school teacher at that time, gave the little boy $1 and said, that was perfectly right what you did. Well, he got let off as a Sunday school teacher. What he was doing, though, was he was commending or honoring this little boy's instinctive sense of justice, protecting a lady, a young girl, his sister, who was being bullied, right? So we can commend honorable things that happen in the culture. Anything that is of good or of a noble character. When we see somebody do something valiantly, you should tell them, even if they're not a Christian, right? If whatsoever things are just, so that's innocent, fair, holy. Whatsoever things are pure, clean, whatever has good motives, what's wholesome, whatsoever thing is lovely. And this is where works of art can be commended. You can stand back and look at a painting of Van Gogh. Do we have a spiritual experience and think about Jesus? No, but we can see inherent beauty in paintings. And so it's lovely. We can think on these things. We can focus on these things. We can boost these things in our culture. And same thing with classical music. I oftentimes put classical music on if I'm studying, if I'm reading or doing something like that. And it's beautiful. There's something lovely about it. Obviously, anything commendable, right? If there are people that we can commend, we should do it. Ideas, institutions, even politicians. If there's something that we can commend, we should. We should hold those things up as Christians and say to society, this is good, right, and holy, and we like this. Also, excellence. In a day where there is very shoddy work that's being done, the Christian should enjoy excellence. Excellence in any craft. You're a woodworker, you're a painter, you're a musician, you're a stoneworker, you're an electrician, you are a manager. Do it excellency. And then if anything else was left out of any of these categories, he says anything worthy of praise, right? Anything else we can think of that still focuses on something in this list that's beautiful, lovely, honorable, pure, all this. We should focus on those things. And the focus isn't relegated to thought alone in our heads, but to action and continued application. We're to think about these things and do these things. And if we observe these things, encourage them. If scrolling social media dampens your spirits and makes you anxious, stop focusing on it. If you're watching something in a way of entertainment and you're uneasy in your spirit, turn it off. Paul was telling these Christians in Philippi to focus on these things themselves and to encourage it in this mixed pagan society, encourage the things that are good, right, and true. Maybe you've listened to a song and it caused you to reflect on something beautiful. Put it in your playlist. Listen to it again. Perhaps you saw somebody do something commendable. Go and tell them, especially if it's a little kid. You can steer them in the right direction. Focusing on the whatevers, you can see literally. You could literally be someone's lifeline in a dark and twisted world. Focusing on the whatevers can lead people to the source of beauty. So, in conclusion, we don't have to be afraid of the world, but we can be the salt, light, and leaven that this world desperately needs. Do not look at those things that cause fear, depression, and darkness, but rather look at those noble and elevated things, as Paul tells us here. If we look at those things that are filled with light, we ourselves will be filled with light, and others are longing for that light. Love's perfection drives us to redeem the lost world's whatevers for the King's glory. Grace has freed you from the world's hostility towards God for the world's transformation. And I'd like to end with this song. Brightly beams our Father's mercy from his lighthouse evermore, but to us he gives the keeping of the lights along the shore. Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the wave. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman you may rescue, you may save. Dark the night of sin is settled, loud the angry billows roar. Eager eyes are watching, longing for the lights along the shore. Trim your feeble lamp, my brother, some poor seaman tempest tossed, trying now to make the harbor in the darkness may be lost. Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the wave. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman you may rescue, you may save. If this has been a blessing to you, then I would ask that you would visit www.godsresistance.com. And if you feel so inclined, then /donate to donate to us. And we will see you in the next episode. Thank you.